Next Village San Francisco is a local nonprofit providing services and support that empower seniors to live independently in their own homes. We welcome people who want to keep connected with their community as members, volunteers, and supporters. We host 30 to 40 free activities and events each month for the public, and our members have access to our network of volunteers. Learn more and get involved at nextvillagesf.org. We hope you enjoy this video.
Hello, everybody out there in Next Village, San Francisco and other parts. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited about talking about hiking the Continental Divide Trail, which is a 3,100-mile trail. At least that's the official distance between Mexico and Canada. It starts off in the south in New Mexico and ends up on the Canadian border in Glacier National Park up in Montana. So it was a wonderful adventure. And I hope to share with you, some of my experiences on there. Almost every day was an adventure, actually. So I've just picked out a few little stories to tell today. The Continental Divide Trail is really one of the most wild and scenic trails in the United States. And it goes right along America's backbone. It goes right up the watersheds. That's why it's called the Continental Divide Trail, because it separates the watersheds, waters that flow to the Pacific Ocean, to the west, and to the Atlantic Ocean to the east, with a couple of exceptions, including the Great Basin, or the Basin in Wyoming, and also the very last couple of days you hike along a watershed that flows into the Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean. So a little bit about me. I retired in February 2019 as an engineer, assistant director for public works at the county, and by March I was on the trail for the Pacific Crest Trail. And when I got to the middle of Oregon, I met up with a guy named Mojo. That's his trail name. My trail name is Finder. And you get these trail names, some other hikers give them to you based on things that happen. But in any case, I hiked with Mojo up to Canada in 2019. And then in 2021, Mojo invited me to hike with him on the Appalachian Trail. And so I started with him in Georgia. I can't even think, Springer Mountain. And then I ended up dropping out in Vermont, middle of Vermont, because I ended up with trench foot. But I had a good time with Mojo until the very end. And so when I was planning for my Continental Divide hike last year in January, I invited Mojo to come along with me. And we're going to tell some stories about Mojo along the way. You're going to see him in some of the photographs that I had. So let's get started here. Actually, I just want to mention, I'm going to probably go through a little bit on planning and preparation for long distance hikes. And it can be for whether it's the Pacific Crest Trail, the Appalachian Trail, or the CDT. Some of the training that goes on before you go on a hike. And then to share with you again my adventures and some of the great people that I met along the trail. So I'm going to screen share here. Oops, this is not what I want. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see this first picture of the Continental Divide sign. So the Continental Divide is really a varied trail. It varies as much as all these signposts and guide markers that we have that I saw along the trail. This is a map showing where the trail from Mexico to Canada, and most of the people hike south to north. There are some people that are known as snowboarders that start in Canada in late June or early July, and then finish up in November at the Mexican border. But I started April 15th, and the trail runs through, I took it through the Gila River, and you go through Ghost Ranch, through the Rockies, up through the Basin in Wyoming and southern Wyoming, through Yellowstone, along the Idaho-Montana border, near Butte and Anaconda, and then eventually, of course, ending up here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up in Glacier National Park at the Canadian border. And these are just adjust something here. There we go. These are the three main long distance trails in the United States. Congress designated a National Scenic Trail Program back in 1968 The Continental Divide Trail was added to it in 1978. And this is the blue trail here. Pacific Crest Trail goes through California, Oregon, Washington, basically along the Sierras and the Cascades. And then the Appalachian Trail, which is the oldest trail that was actually started to be built out in the 20s, here between Georgia and Mount Katahdin in Maine. What's interesting about the Continental Divide Trail, besides it's really, really wild, is that as long as you're within about 50 miles of the actual Continental Divide, you're considered hiking the trail. The other trails are more precise. There aren't really that many alternates along the trail, versus the Continental Divide Trail. There are recognized alternates that show up in maps. So there's an official trail that's put out there by the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, which is some of the private and public partners that work on the trail and establish the trail. And so the official trail last year was 3,100 miles. But my route, because I took some of the alternates, was 2,600 miles. And the Gila River here in New Mexico is an example, one of those alternates that shaves off probably 100 miles from the official trail that goes out in the deserts. Let's see. There we go. So first thing I want to talk about here is the gear. You want to hike with as light as possible gear that you can. So this is all my gear as I started off the trail. I have my sleep system here, which is a quilt and an air mattress that's rated for maximum insulation. My tent, this is my cold weather gear, which was a mid layer and a puffy. My rain gear, rain shell and rain pants. Of course, this is my backpack, my water filtration right in here, and water kits basically. This is the rest of my clothes. It's in this little blue bag. And I've got my GPS up here in this orange device up here, spoon, headlamp, various sundries there, and also my cook pot. I did carry an umbrella for the first time on a long distance trail, mainly because of the sun. Hiking in New Mexico, a lot of it is through deserts or areas that have no shade. But I ended up liking it even when we would have thunderstorms and things like that. So I carried the umbrella the entire length of the trail. So my starting weight, everything here was 21 pounds, which is considered a little bit on the heavy side. Usually want to be between, say, 18 and 20 for just a lightweight pack. And then ultra lightweight backpackers are down around 12 pounds, 10 to 12 pounds. But you give up a lot of comfort items by doing that. For example, an ultra lightweight backpacker would not have a pot or a stove or a fuel canister. You just cold soak everything and just eat everything cold, basically. Now, I did send my ice axe and boot spikes for traction when I got to Colorado, so that added in a couple more pounds to my base weight. Another thing is I prepare a resupply plan, and so this is my spreadsheet for this. The kind of the orange yellow bands here are where I was planning on sending some boxes. And actually sent fewer boxes than what's shown on here. I think I sent about 7 of them or so, 7 or 8, or had Donna, my wife, send them to me. And that included resupplies for shoes and besides food. This showed me my mile marker, this town, the mile marker, the distance to next resupply, the number of days of food I would need based on an average 17 miles per day average. Has some dates and cumulative dates, and then other details here, including distance from the trail. You prefer to try to get all your food on the trail if you can. Sometimes I would send, like here, Doc Campbell's the first one. This was a resort. This was a resort that was on the trail, so I could pick up my package there and not have to hitch off the trail. Otherwise, you'd have to go 25, 12, 35 miles, off the trail, and you'd have to hitchhike, and it would just take up more time to do that. And on the other hand, you get some relief in town, and you get to take a shower and do your laundry and that sort of thing as well. So these were my boxes in preparation: food boxes, shoes. I think somewhere in here I have my ice axe. So food planning, you burn probably someone my age between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day, and so you're really looking for foods that give you a lot of calories per ounce. And so that's what you're calculating. you're looking at calories per ounce, and you want to go around 100 calories per ounce. So for 3,000 calories, you need about 2 pounds of food per day that you're carrying. And a lot of it involves nuts or peanut butter, peanut M&Ms, a lot of sports bars that I eat during the day so I can keep walking and not stop. So just keep moving and just eat a bar as I go along. So for training, I mainly trained around Marin. Marin's fantastic for training. My regular kind of routine hike would be from my house in Naval up to the top of Big Rock and back. That would be about a 4-hour round trip hike, and you gain about 2,000 feet. So that was a good hike. But also before starting the trip, I went in March to southern Utah, and then hiked some slot canyons there, the Paria Canyon, and down to Lee's Ferry along the Colorado River. So that was kind of my shakedown hike, checking out all my gear, including my quilt, which the first day when we got up, it was 24 degrees. And so that was a real test to see whether I could stay warm in my quilt, because you only have like 3 sides to your quilt, and how well my air mattress did for that. And so everything worked out pretty good, except for when you roll over, your quilt sometimes lifts up, but I handled that through clipping it in better. And then the actual trip began. So about the closest town that you can get to is Lordsburg, and you can take an Amtrak to get to Lordsburg. So I actually bought a roomette and a sleeping car and left at midnight out of Ontario, California. And then we cruised out to Lordsburg, New Mexico. And here we are getting off the train. And this is Mojo, who I met up on the train. He flew in from Boston to Tucson and then got on the train in Tucson. And the only other people that got off in Lordsburg, some other hikers here, there's 3 or 4 other hikers. And so pretty much everybody gets off, starts in Lordsburg, gets to the southern terminus, and then you hike back about 85 miles to Lordsburg through the desert. So we did spend a night in Lordsburg, and then next day I hired this driver because you've got to get out to this remote spot on a very rough road. So this was Jeffrey, and he took us out here, and this is the starting point. And on the left here is Mexico. And if you turn around 180 degrees, this is now looking north. In Mexico, you look east into Mexico because you're in the boot heel of New Mexico. And then over here on the left, to the west, is the United States. And right here is the wall, coming right here, this barbed wire fence. And actually in the wall where I was standing, there's a gate. We saw some car traffic here on the right from the Mennonites. So you see these green fields over to the right here in Mexico. And so there's a Mennonite colony out there that's developing their fields and all that. On the American side, it's just real thin cattle and desert out there. So in any case, this is the southernmost point of the Continental Divide Trail. They have a monument down there. And here I am getting ready to take off, all excited and fairly clean shaven. And off we go. There's Mojo with his pack. He had a Gossamer gear, and I had a Gossamer gear as well. And we got our first mile under our belts, which is always reassuring. So camping in the desert, it can be quite interesting. It can be really hot because depending when you camp, there's no shade. And if you set up your tent around 7 o'clock, you still have the sun beating down on you. And then the winds can pick up. So I don't know if you can see here on the lower right, there's boulders here, big rocks that we use to keep our tent stakes down on the ground when the winds pick up at night. This was another campsite in the desert. And here we had a few neighbors because we were near a water cache. So the CDTC, this coalition, have built or installed 5 water caches for the first 80 miles of the trail to try to keep people from suffering too much in case they weren't prepared for collecting water or managing their water when they're hiking. I had my sun umbrella here, which was really handy. And Mojo brought a sun umbrella as well. And we saw this scene fairly often along this section of the hike, just dead cows out there. This is one of the water caches that are organized by the CDTC. And you can see there's a couple guys actually here that's in the only shade they could find. This guy here is taking care of blisters already on the first couple of days. And as it turns out, Mojo started getting these blisters that merged into one big blister. and he lost like a third of the skin off the bottom of his foot, which was not good. More about that later. Here's one tree along this section of the trail, and there's a water cache here. So there were quite a few hikers at that particular point. For most of the trail, you didn't see very many hikers. You know, in town you would. I think twice I went 2 whole days, like 48 hours, and not see one person, not even a day hiker, not even any vehicle traffic or anything. So besides a couple of water caches, or 5 or 6 water caches, this was your typical water source. You can see this is a water trough for cattle. You can see all the cow pallets around here. And this was our water. And so you'd have to filter your water. And I would also sometimes add chlorine tablets to the filtered water, depending on how murky and green the water sources were. I love the desert, actually. Just loved hiking out there. The sunsets and the sunrises were just gorgeous. And I just felt good for me, nice and dry air. This was our last night before getting to Lordsburg with Mojo. And it was one of the last nights with Mojo, period, because when we got to Lordsburg, he went to the doctor, went to the hospital there, and the doctor told him he had to stay off his foot for at least 10 days. And he wasn't just going to sit in Lordsburg or fly back to Boston right away. So he gave it a go. He went past the 100-mile mark coming out of Lordsburg. But that was about it. He couldn't keep hiking with the bottom of his the skin off the bottom of one of his feet missing. So he left the trail and he flew back to Boston, but he's going to show up again later on. I kept hiking without Mojo, and there are a lot of interesting features and attractions along the CDT. This one was kind of a surprise. I ended up camping here. This was sort of a trailer park. It's called Burro Mountain, and this was the original homestead. And let's see, in 1933, this was the Western White House. So Franklin Roosevelt was friends with the homesteader, and actually the homesteader parents. And so he spent some of the summer out here and working on, as president. And also, interestingly enough, the daughter that was born in the original homestead family, they sent her back to New York to get an education, be cultured and all that from the wilds of New Mexico. And she ended up becoming friends with Eleanor, and she was one of the bridesmaids when Eleanor married Franklin Roosevelt. So just interesting. Didn't know that this was the case up there. You have other attractions along the trail, like this homeowner. This is their driveway to their house. They decided to line it with toilets for some reason. There's the registry. This is where you register for hiking the Continental Divide Trail, and you can see this mailbox on top of a tree stump. So I was headed towards Silver City, and Silver City is home of the annual trail days. So each of these trails, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide, has an annual hiker festival. And so this time I was able to actually hike right into town on the weekend that they're having the festival. And it was a lot of fun. As I was hiking into town, let me just mention here, this is also Stormwalker. He hiked the CDT, I think, in the 80s, early 80s, which was pretty primitive back then. And he was going around, and if you were a thru hiker, he would give you a $2 bill, and I had him sign it as a souvenir of your thru hike. So he was kind of an interesting fellow. In any case, the day before I got into Silver City, Whistler texted me that he was in town and wanted to meet up with me and maybe hike together. And so we met, had dinner together, and we decided to proceed hiking as hiking buddies. Whistler had hiked the Pacific Crest Trail the same year that I did, and we'd been just a few miles apart, and we never actually met each other. But my wife, Donna, actually helped him and through his wife also do some logistics and resupply issues that he had. He ended up slipping on a snowfield and then falling and breaking his ribs, a few ribs. He had to go back home, and then he came back and actually finished the PCT in 2019. So he's a tough guy. So anyway, we left Silver City together, and we took one of the alternates, which is the Gila River alternate. And see here, I'm looking at these falling trees as we're going down one of the slot canyons into the Gila River. And the Gila River is just beautiful. It's just one of the nicest sections of the CDT. Love to go back there again. And like the day before we got down into the canyon itself, we met up with these other two guys, Beer, a guy from Germany, and that's how he got his trail name. And then Uncle Sam, who was a ex-Green Beret and was had PTSD and was doing outdoor therapy. And so there were actually four of us that were hiking up through the canyon. And let's see if I can get this to play. And so going up the Gila River, we had to cross it 257 times over the course of like 2.5 days. That's Uncle Sam. That's me in the front there. So we did this more or less, sometimes with beeper because there'd be beaver dams and it would, raise the water levels. This is one of our camps. So this was really a good time on the CDT, was going through the Gila River. We took a side trip at one point up to these cliff dwellings. And this was just remarkable, the culture that lived here and basically the architecture and innovations that they did to build basically their city or town in these overhangs. So that was a fun side trip. The Gila River also had hot springs. So this was one of the best hot springs along the river. This was separate and above the river, but it was like 100, 102 degrees, perfectly clear water, no sulfur smell. So it was fun to soak in the hot springs for an hour or so before hitting the trail again. Eventually, we had to leave the Gila River. We climbed out of the canyon. And as we were climbing out, I think a day after we got through here, and actually higher up, you're in some trees, a forest fire broke out. And this was kind of a continuing theme while hiking New Mexico. There were a lot of forest fires and we were dodging them all the time. So we were out of here just the day before. The hikers behind us had to be evacuated through Forest Service pickup trucks and stuff. But this was another water source in New Mexico. They call these cattle ponds tanks. So you see USGS maps and it would say tank. And at first I was expecting an actual steel tank, but it would just be a pond, sometimes with water, sometimes with no water. So here you can again see the cow patties and the hoof marks. But this is our filtering system. So we'd have these plastic flexible 2-liter containers. We call them knock bags. And then you had a soil filter that you squeeze through, and then you'd have your clear water in the end, and then you'd have to backwash your filter with clear water every now and then as well to keep it from plugging up. And probably over 90% of the people of the hikers use this system for their water supply. And then while in New Mexico, I also would throw in a tablet of chlorine depending on the water quality. There's things called trail angels on the trail. Some of those just individuals that will stop their car or see you and they'll give you a beer or chips, a bag of chips. Other times they'll leave it along the trail. In this case, Davila Ranch, they took this shed up here and converted it into kind of a sanctuary for hikers. I actually met John Davila. He came out on his motorcycle, his dirt bike, but he took the shed out there and he put a shower in here. And on the right, there's a washer and dryer. And they had a refrigerator, and he had onions, eggs, he had cans of beans, potatoes. Oh, that's right, potatoes. So Whistler and I, we made up this big kind of potato scramble. And here we are in our loner clothes. So when you're hiking, basically all the clothes you have is what you're wearing. And so when you have to do your laundry, you got to strip all your clothes off. And usually you just put on your rain shell and your rain pants, if you're in town or whatever. In this case, we had our loner clothes. We also were hiking off and on with this other woman hiker, this French-Canadian woman named Just Mary. So here we are, we're showing that we finished up our plates. So that was a good day also. We had a great time there and got our clothes laundered and showered and everything, and we were ready to go. Kind of the next stop and landmark is a place called Pie Town. So I think in the 20s or 30s, this used to be a stop where along this old highway where people would stop, and then the locals would bake pies and sell pies, and it being called Pie Town. And there's the restaurant here, the Pioneer. And of course, going there, I had to stop for a pie. And this was the only pie they had. It's interesting, throughout most of New Mexico and even into Colorado and even some of the big cities, there were like food shortages. Like we were in Leadville and there was no food. No lettuce in Leadville. Here they would come out and they say, we've got 3 hamburger patties. Who wants a hamburger? Or you got, a pork chop and something else. Who wants this? So, I ended up cooking my own meal, but did have pie here. They also had a couple of side rooms that were just plastered with LPs. And I took a picture of this one. This is kind of strange, but I bet you these are worth something. Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, music from outer space. Also in Pie Town, there's the Toaster House. And so this is a hostel. A person used to live here, Nita, and then she moved out and then kept this open for hikers, CDT hikers, and also the Great Divide bike riders. So the Great Divide bike route, which comes from Canada to Mexico, passes through Pie Town. So there's like an air pump thing right here. But people would send her toasters for some reason. It got to be a thing. And so we were at the Toaster House. And it's also where I sent one of my first boxes. And so this is what it looks like. I've got this colored tape so I can identify it easily. And also this tape's wrapped around my hiking pole. So, if I go into a post office, I can show them my hiking pole and say, okay, I'm looking for a box that has this colored tape. And then this is a popular spot for people to ship their shoes to. And they would nail them to this wall of the house for some reason. And while I was there, this other guy comes up with his shoes just badly mangled. And he searched through here until he found a shoe that was his size. And he pulled it off the wall, hung up his old pair and took those shoes and kept on hiking. So coming out of Pie Town, there's a lot of gravel road walking. You're not really on a trail, not much vehicle traffic either. But I really got my toes damaged. And I won't show that picture too long. When I got to Grant, New Mexico, I had to go to the hospital and one of my toes got infected and had to have it lance and drain. And then I stayed there for 3 days to sort of recover and then headed on back up the trail. This was a fortunate evening that I was able to soak my feet in one of the cattle troughs where we were camped. These were also fairly typical in New Mexico, where there was an old well with a windmill, and then they converted to solar panels. And they still have a little pencil pump here, and they pump the water out to a trough. And this was one of our water sources as we were hiking north. Besides cows, we also did see a few llamas along the way, which is kind of interesting. You've seen these things out there. We were continuously climbing in New Mexico from the south to the north, and we got to these mesas, higher elevation mesas that had trees, pine trees, and the water supply was definitely better. But eventually we had to drop back down as we got closer to Ghost Ranch. So we had to go back into the desert. And this one area in the desert was really interesting. For about 5, maybe 10 miles or so, we would see these fluorescent green lizards. So I had to take a picture here and show you this. There's cactus again and everything. And pencil choyas. Again, we were running into dead cows as we were crossing through this desert section. There was one water cache, and this was a little less sophisticated. This was near a paved road, and somebody would drop off these refilled bottles for water. I ended up filtering because just couldn't really trust where this water came from, but at least it was good to have the water there. I included this photo to show you what a typical lunch would look like on the trail. So a lot of times I bought flour tortillas and then had peanut butter or maybe Nutella. Sometimes I would switch back and forth, or sometimes just put the tuna fish I'd put in here. But in this case, I had peanut butter, and then I would crumple up some corn chips on top and maybe some beef jerky, try to get as many calories as I could with as light as weight as possible. I mentioned fires, and so there were several large fires. And as we were hiking through this section, which was in the Santa Fe National Forest, the day after we got through it, they closed the entire forest down. And so all the CDT hikers that were behind us had to get off the trail and had to start road walking through this section. This included Ghost Ranch, which is where Georgia O'Keeffe painted a lot of her paintings out there. So this was her own cottage. You could actually go inside and visit it. At that point, we were entering Carson National Forest. And the day we finished hiking through Carson National Forest, they shut that down. And again, when we got to town, we were seeing a lot of hikers just walking up the paved roads because they shut down the forest. This was a shoe resupply at Ghost Ranch. And these are my Olympus that I started off with. And then to get more life, actually the two guys we're hiking with, Beer and Uncle Sam, when we were the last day in the Gila River, they both twisted their ankles crossing the streams, and their ankles inflamed and had to get off the trail. So Beer gave me one of his inserts so I could extend the life of my shoes. Here I am coming out of Ghost Ranch. Again, we're climbing, getting towards the Colorado border. This photograph, if you look through the gap, you can see a little bit of snow. We started encountering some snow, but it wasn't anything significant. This particular outhouse was in a campground that hadn't yet been open to the public, but the CDT went by nearby, and so we decided to camp here. And in 2015, Otter, a CDT hiker, was here late season. I think it was southbound, and it was late October, early November. Other hikers were telling me the story, and he a freak snowstorm, I shouldn't say freak, but a large snowstorm happened, and he got stuck here and he ended up starving to death and dying in this outhouse. And so there's a little memorial there. Eventually we made it to the Colorado-New Mexico border. And again, I'm hiking with Whistler, and we're exiting the Carson National Forest. And the next day they shut this down. We hitched a ride into Chama. I included this to show you kind of a very typical scene you'd see along the CDT in towns, either post office or maybe a resort. People would get a package or they'd buy a bag of groceries, and then you go outside and you empty your pack. And a lot of times you're drying some of your gear if it's been wet because of thunderstorms, and then you repack everything and off you go on the trail again. They did have an old-fashioned phone booth in Chama, so I had to show this. There are a few of these we saw along the trail, actually. From Chama, we went back up to Coomers Pass early one morning, and we headed north. And the weather forecast was not good, and we were now well above 10,000 feet, and we were starting to hit some snowpack at that point, which had been a lower than average snow year last year. And so this was people. We met this other hiker that hiked this before, and he said this was so easy now compared to other years. But in any case, we were out there in the snowpack. Now there's certain challenges along the trail. And so there's a 24-24-24 challenge. And that's, you have to hike at least 24 hours, go at least 24 miles, and drink 24 beers. So this guy passed us, a young hiker, super light pack, but on top of it, he had a 30-pack case of beer. And so he was on his 24-24-24 challenge. And we never knew if he made it, because here we are in the evening at our campsite, and it was by now blowing like 40-50 miles an hour. And we found this one little spot of trees because you're kind of up on a plateau. This is the remaining snowpack. And then overnight, it snowed about 4 to 6 inches. So here we are in the morning. I took a picture out of my tent towards Whistler's tent. He's getting ready. This is sunrise. And we talked about it. And the forecast was for 2 more days of this, in evening and nighttime snows. And we had another 65 miles to go, I think, to the next road. So we decided that we'd turn around and take this alternate called the Elwood alternate, or the Great Divide alternate. So we turned around. This is us hiking back out. You can see here's a little cairn for the trail. We're just going over the snow. And we took this alternate, which had some paved road walks, a lot of it on Forest Service roads, and even one section along an abandoned railroad track along the river, which was very interesting, although hard walking because the railroad ties are not spaced the right distance for your pace. And we got to Creed in Colorado, and that's an interesting town. They were having a taste of Creed, so there was like a festival going on. But in the evening, we went down to the city ball field, and you could camp here. And since there was a threat of rain, Whistler set up his tent here in the dugout. I just set up my tent towards the outfield somewhere. Coming out of Creed, we also were hiking through mining districts. There were these old wood buildings and these mine shafts that you could see all over the place. It was really interesting. Well, we got back onto the main line, or the red line as it's known. And it's kind of deceiving. This mountaintop here is over 14,000 feet high. And we're going to cross right here where these clouds are almost kind of a coal here. That was where the trail went. And for most, or I think the average elevation for the CDT in Colorado is like 10,100 feet. And most nights in Colorado, we camp between 10 and 12,000 feet. Usually 11,000 feet was not uncommon for us to be camping at that elevation. And we'd get, snowed on every now and then, not too often, but it was very, very cold throughout all of Colorado. But beautiful, just gorgeous, gorgeous scenery. This picture doesn't do justice, but you're looking at all the Rocky Mountains and just these vistas with, other than this 2-track that we were following, don't see another road, you don't see another person, just these gorgeous vistas out there. Also at that point, where the CDT and the Colorado Trail, which is an east-west trail in Colorado, are the same. So it's kind of interesting. We met up with a couple people that were hiking on the Colorado Trail. But there was a lot of snow and a lot of post-holing as we were going through Colorado. And post-holing is when you're walking over snow and it collapses underneath your foot. And so you go down, just imagine like a fence post, and you take, to put the post in the ground, you've got to dig a post hole. And so that's what happens with one or both of your feet. Sometimes the snow is only 12 or 18 inches. And other times the snow, you can go up to your crotch because there's cavities where there's windfalls and things like that. And it's really dangerous. You can easily break your leg or hurt yourself because you'll fall into either a rock or a tree stump or something like that that's beneath the snow. You can also see here, I've got my ice axe on my back, and so some more pictures of us hiking up through these slopes. And this is what's dangerous, is when you're doing traverses. Now here we had a flat section of rock, but if you slip out here, you can slide down and either hit rocks or trees. Whistler, I think, does have his ice axe. Not only just has a pole, but you'll pull out your ice axe, and that's where you'll use it when you're making these traverses. And you also use them if you have to do glissade. So here one morning, we just gotten up and only about an hour in, and we get to the top of this pass. This is Lake Ann Pass. This is Lake Ann down below to the north. And there's probably a 10-foot cornice that ran along this whole rim, this whole ridge, except for one spot that wasn't so bad. So, we stopped. I put on my rain pants so I could slide easier. And then you take out your ice axe, and then you kind of usually lay on your back, but because of our packs, you kind of lay on your side. And then you start slide down, and we slid all the way down to about here. And then we had to keep walking on the trail. This is Whistler that took a picture of me as I'm sliding down. You can see the cornice up here. And then we got down below, and here's Lake Ann. Just a lot of snow. But the scenery, again, is gorgeous. The other thing that you ran into more and more is our windfalls. The trail crews had not been out here because the snows had, for the lot of this area, the snows had just melted. And so they hadn't come out to clear the trail, but you'd have to hike through areas like this, and you barely could make 1 mile an hour. And sometimes there was snow, and then you'd be punching through the snow with these trees here. This one section, there was a sign that the year before, 2 trail crews, I think, had spent 2 months clearing like 2 miles of trail through here. And so this is what it looks like after they cut out the windfalls. Here's an example of trail magic. This was in Colorado, near a dirt road, and somebody went out there and left some beers along the trail and in a rock. So this is wonderful. These are some other people. We were hiking along a Forest Service road, and they just showed up in their new Jeep here and had a cooler, and they had some, I think, some soft drinks and chips and cookies that they gave us. It was just the nicest people. And there weren't a lot, but there were enough that made your day when you met up with some of these trail angels. Of course, we saw a lot of wildlife along the way. There's a fox, and we saw mountain goats, mountain sheep as well. I didn't have a picture of them. A lot of grouse, lots of grouse. And I think this is a grouse, but we also saw some ptarmigans as well. And moose, had a couple of moose encounters, including one in Glacier that was pretty scary. But we'll talk about that later on. So what happened was Mojo came back after his foot healed. Flew back to Colorado, and he got in on the trail at a place called Twin Lakes, about 4 days ahead of us, ahead of Whistler and I. And we were hiking faster than he was. He was just trying to get his trail legs back. And so we caught up to Mojo here at Ptarmigan Pass. And so it was fun. This was one picture of all three of us. And actually, this picture was taken. We actually hit some really steep, forested snowbanks that we were having a real hard time traveling through. And then also these other areas that had steep traverses that we ended up deciding to hike along this knife edge to avoid these traverses in the snow. So you can see part of the CDT trail here, but actually would run through the snowbank and then continue on the snowbank here. So instead we just walk along the tops of the mountains. So really risky and everything. But then the next day we're just navigating a little creek. We were coming up to a Forest Service road, and Whistler slipped on some mud into the creek. And we thought at first that he had just badly sprained his ankle. But as it turns out, he fractured his fibula in 2 places. So he basically broke his leg. We got to this, he was about 100 yards from this dirt road. So we kind of hobbled over to this road. We were wondering what to do and whether we needed to use our GPS or satellite SOS button, when this guy shows up in a 4-wheeler, an employee for the Denver Water Agency. And we start talking to him, and Mojo and I are asking him about where these roads go to. And he tells us the roads are dead ends. You can't get out here. And the only way in is blocked by a snow cornice. But we were on the western side of the Continental Divide, and Denver Water Agency collects the water here in these little concrete head walls and pipes, and sends them through like a 10-foot high tunnel through the mountain to the east and eventually to Denver. And the tunnel happened to be down for maintenance. So this guy went back to his cabin and then radioed his boss and got permission to lower a 4-wheeler into the tunnel. It's about 15 feet down in this little shed. We weren't allowed to take any pictures because it's considered critical infrastructure. And then we loaded up. Whistler actually had a hop on the ladder down into the 4-wheeler. And then this guy drove him like 3,000 feet under the mountain through the tunnel to the other side to US 40. Whistler was able to hitch a ride because he wasn't allowed to actually drive him anywhere beyond that point. But he had to hitch a ride with his broken leg to Winter Park. And then he got there late, and then the next morning he went into urgent care there, and they took x-rays and determined that he'd broken his foot or his leg. Next day, Mojo and I had to climb up over the cornice, and while we're trying to avoid snows, this guy's coming up the hill, or up the mountain, with his skis and his ski boots, and he just cruises up this mountain just like nothing. And we saw him go to the very top of the peak and then slalom down the mountain. So anyway, we're in Colorado still. We're made it up to Rocky Mountain National Park. And north out of there, we go up through Lakeview Peak, which is one of the steeper sections of the whole CDT. People going southbound run into trouble through this section because they're very exposed. And so if you're coming through here in July or August, lightning's a big issue. And so it wasn't much for us at this point, but you can see the shed with, or this lookout with these lightning rods up here. Continuing north, we were by Steamboat Springs, and we were encountering snows again. And this is one of the last pictures again of Mojo, because he ended up post-holing badly. When you're moving pretty fast and you post-hole, your pack weight will throw you forward. The momentum of your pack will push you forward, and you can end up face planting in the snow. Well, he ended up pulling his hamstring and I think torquing his knee in one of these post holes. And so he couldn't keep on, so he exited the trail here and went back to hitched a ride to Steamboat Springs, and then eventually flew back home. And so that was the end of his hike on the CDT last year. Although he is planning to go back, I think, this year. So I was by myself at that point, and I hadn't even reached halfway of the trail yet. So here I am the next day, I think, in one of my campsites, headed north towards Wyoming. And when you get to the northern end of Colorado, it all changes. You start losing elevation. You end up back in rangeland, sagebrush, it's kind of desert-like. You see cactus again. And I think these are horned toad lizards, something like that, horny lizards. Rattlesnakes. This guy almost stepped on. It was morning, luckily, so he wasn't moving very fast. And just out in the sagebrush. I hadn't actually reached the heart of the basin yet. I was following this road for almost 2 days, and over 2 days, there was one vehicle that passed me. That's how kind of desolate it is. And I camped here because there was a little muddy creek, about the only source of water in this valley that was passing through. But in the evening, these guys show up. I'd been leapfrogging with them a number of days. And so this is Half Mile Gin, Porky, and Kingpin. Those were their trail names. And they were young hikers that were just blasting through. And so they were doing the 24-hour challenge. So the 24-hour challenge is hike as far as you can in 24 hours. And so these guys ended up doing 60 miles. But the night before, 2 of the guys had left and they had hiked, I think, 72 miles, I think in 24 hours, which is just incredible how they could do that. They were some of the fastest hikers on the trail. Half Mile Gin here, he had a really light pack, very lightweight, but he carried a drone on his front pocket, and he would post, I think on Instagram, some drone footage, and especially his drone footage in the Rockies when he was having to down climb some places or go over cornices. Just amazing drone footage that he had. Yeah, so that's another challenge, a 24-hour challenge. Coming north out of Rawlins, you're now actually in the basin. And this is like scary for a lot of people because there's very little water and there's no shade. And this is what it looks like for 100 miles, pretty much. And you're following either a 2-track or maybe a Jeep trail, and it's just sagebrush. I did see wild horses. And I even one morning saw 2 stallions fighting and chasing each other in the sagebrush. And they came within 20 feet of me or so. They just came over this hill and I could hear these hoofbeats. And I was wondering what was that sound. And then all of a sudden they just burst over the hill and just passed right by me. Also, when I took this picture, I was headed down to this water source here on the left, this little stock pond. And there were a bunch of cows here. And in the middle of the cows, as I was scaring them away to get to the water, was a bull. And it was not a friendly bull. It started pawing the ground and lowering its head, and it was going to charge me. So I quickly ran around the pond and I grabbed some water along the way and then took off up in the sagebrush to filter it out away from the bull. There was one water cache. This was it. It had the fence to keep the cattle away. But during the hiking through the basin, again, there's no trees, no shade. I got hit by thunderstorms in the afternoons. And so you'd be out there and there'd be just lightning kind of coming down around you. Luckily, none of it came really close to me, but I had hail, particularly one afternoon. It was pretty heavy hail and high winds and things like that. And then in the evenings, it'd all blow by and it'd be beautiful and umbrella or rainbows. There's a section that you hike that's part of the Oregon Trail and the Pony Express. And eventually you get to the end of the basin and you can start to see the Winds, which is the next major hiking area that you enter. I did get off the trail to resupply in Lander, Wyoming. And this is 4th of July. So I ended up hitching a ride in on the 3rd. Post office was closed. So Don had sent me a box with, I think, a new pair of pants because I'd worn through my one pair of pants at that point. So I had to wait till the next day, the 5th, to get the mail. So I was able to stay in town and watch the parade. And also my daughter and her boyfriend are big rock climbers, and Lander's a big rock climbing place, and they have a lot of friends there. So I got invited over to some of their friends, or one of their friends' place, for 4th of July party. And in Wyoming, they love their guns. And so the thing there was to shoot this pellet gun or BB gun at the beer. Then you had to shoot, you had to drink the beer once they shot the beer, but you had to hold the beer. And I got to partake in that. They also love their fireworks, and you would not believe the fireworks that people had there. They must spend thousands of dollars. They had mortars, and in the evening, the whole town was lit up. They also had these traditions of Roman candle shootouts in one of the vacant lots near downtown Lander. And so these are basically my daughter's friends and their friends that are out there in the vacant lot shooting Roman candles at each other. I don't know if this is the one scene where, oh yeah, right there. I see the little flame. So the fire day gets started. So I go over to put out the fire. The crazy times. The winds, though, are just beautiful. The central and northern winds, I should say, are beautiful. The southern winds are just a mess of fallen trees. It's really hard to hike through there. But here you're in the central winds. But it was right after the snows had melted. And so the mosquitoes were just horrendous. You pretty much hiked all day with a head net. At night, you'd eat your dinner and you would lift up your head net and spoon food into you and put the head net back down. And also you enter into grizzly country. And so when I was in Lander, I also bought bear spray because I'm used to black bears, not too worried about black bears. And, you know, I did bear safe type camping anyway, but with grizzlies, they're more aggressive. And so I had the bear spray. Just continuing on in the winds, you get up high in these granites. It's beautiful. The lakes, it reminds me a lot of the North Cascades. I was crossing this one creek, and it was towards the end of the day. My shoes had finally dried out because there were a number of creek crossings that you had to wade through the creeks. I didn't want to get my shoes wet again. And so I thought I could rock hop the creek. Well, as it turned out, I slipped on one of the rocks and I fell backwards into the water, and I lost my hiking poles, which are really essential for distributing your weight and getting the weight off your knees and that sort of thing. And, you know, long story short, one of the hiking poles drifted away and I lost my hiking pole. I did jump out really quick, you know, dried off my phone, I camped right next to the river and, you know, tried to dry out all my clothes before the sunset. But my phone camera started going bad. And so my pictures were all very fuzzy, took very few pictures by that point. I did hitch into Du Bois, Wyoming. And the person that picked me up, the trail angel, was, again, a veteran, had PTSD, and he was just kind of traveling the country. And you know, I was telling him stories about the trail as we were driving to Du Bois, and I told him about losing my hiking pole and falling in the creek and all that. And he just gave me one of his hiking poles, and I ended up hiking with that all the way to the end of the hike up to you know, Canada, and brought it home with me. So just a generosity from just strangers, just they'd be willing to do that. And you know, he definitely needed his hiking poles, but he was willing to give me one of them. So so a lot of my pictures end up being fuzzy until I got to Yellowstone, to Old Faithful in Yellowstone, which is almost all the way out of Yellowstone at that point. And I just, out of habit, took out my phone, take a picture, and it worked. So I call it the Old Faithful Geyser miracle, that my phone just started to work again. And so it felt really good, felt really accomplished, just to have hiked from the Mexican border all the way up to Yellowstone and seeing Old Faithful. I mean, it's just something that I thought about. I'd never been to Yellowstone before, and here I was hiking through Yellowstone and seeing the geothermal features. One night I did have wolves that were howling next to me, and it happened to be on a full moon, and that was a little disconcerting. Saw elk, huge elk. This is skull and the rack of one of the elks. One of the other hikers did actually see a wolf in person, actually. From Yellowstone, you go to pass into Idaho, and for a while you hike along the Idaho-Montana border. And by then, at the high elevation, it's springtime. So snows have melted and the flowers are out, and it's beautiful. And it's just beautiful scenery, although it was fairly dry as you got up in that area. Again, I put this picture in because every day was like an adventure. So here I am taking off in the morning on this trail. I don't know how this person got their four-wheeler up here, but he got it up this far and he flipped it and left it there. I did stop and look around, make sure there wasn't a body somewhere. But that's where it was. You know, I don't know how they're ever going to get it out because there was miles to the closest road. This is very common scenery. That's a section of the trail, Idaho, Montana. There are some trees, but then mainly kind of open grassland, a lot of cattle. Water was hard to come by. Your campsites were sometimes very exposed like this. This was on a ridge crest. No water. sometimes it'd be a hard hitch to get into town. This was spent a couple hours trying to hitch a ride from this pass, and this guy pulling a trailer with, like, he told me 10 or 12,000 pounds of steel guardrail in the back, picked me up, and we're going down a steep grade, and he blows a tire, and he had to drag it a little ways, so he had to change the tire out. And this, we were headed into Lador, and again there are fires burning nearby. This is the city park, another place where you could camp out in Lador. You're also in this area of Idaho and Montana, is where the Lewis and Clark expedition passed through both times when they were westbound and back eastbound. This is one of the passes that they went through. This is the headwaters of the Missouri River. And so in the diaries, they describe standing astride the headwaters of the Missouri. And so this is also a park that's in honor of Sacagawea. So I had to do the same thing, stand across the head of the Missouri. As I mentioned, there are fires nearby, and you had to hike through burn zones, and you had to camp in burn zones, which aren't fun, although this particular campsite was just on the edge. I had a little bit of green grass. It's hard hiking, again, with the windfalls from the burn zones. You do occasionally get into some beautiful areas. This is the Pentler Wilderness Area, just outside of Anaconda. But again, you'd have to go through these windfalls. I did take a picture of this trail crew. So once I passed them, it was easy going because all the windfalls had been cleared out. So, I gave them my thanks and said, can I take a picture of you guys, clearing the trail? And so they posed for me. I walked right into, right into town from the mountain into Anaconda, and stayed at the Pinter Portal, this very new hostel. That was one of the nicest hostels I've ever been to. It's brand new. It's just really well done, kind of a European flavor. Again, these are some of the group that I would leapfrog over every now and then. Again, there's Kingpin, Half Mile Gin, and Porky here, and a couple other people. Some of them were faster hikers, so they overtook me and kept on going. And you have to cross from one mountain range to another. So here I am crossing from the Pinter Range over towards the Scapegoat Wilderness. There's the big smelter in Anaconda. I did hitch into Helena, the capital of Montana, and met up with Simone, my daughter, and her boyfriend Seth. So that was fun. They met up with me, and then we had dinner together. The next morning, they drove me to the trailhead, and back on the trail as was that. And just headed north. We went through Rogers Pass, which is held the record for the coldest temperature. Initially, the coldest temperature ever recorded in the United States, but then eventually Alaska had a colder temperature. So I just can't imagine being working up here on the mine, Rogers Pass. And so the person that read the thermometer was out here in this cabin, and it was minus 70 degrees. It's incredible. Entered the Scapegoat Wilderness again towards the end. I was expecting it to be lush and green and kind of like Glacier National Park, but instead it was just more dry, very dry areas. Here I am in a green zone, and I just put this picture in to show you how you would hang if you had the appropriate trees, because a lot of times it's hard to find a tall tree. You'd hang your bear bag, put all your food in here. I also had an earth sack that I was carrying with me, which is a Kevlar bag that I could tie to a tree if I couldn't hang my food. And then I would set my cook pot a ways from my tent and not have any food in my tent. And so this evening, I hear my cook pot suddenly bang around, and I jump out of my tent to see what was going on. And here was this deer that had kicked over my cook pot and was like licking and chewing stuff around my camp. And it actually had taken out the little bag that held my stove and ate my bag. Luckily, it didn't eat my stove. So I chased this deer off and kind of put some rocks around my cook pot. Entered into the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area. A lot of it also was in a burn zone, but there's a spectacular, I can't remember the distance. I want to say like 12-mile cliff that runs along here. This is escarpment called the Chinese Wall. And it's just gorgeous as you hike along the edge of it. So I was passing from one ridge to another and took a wide angle shot here of the Chinese Wall. And in this area, it was nice and green and lush. And started getting some bridges instead of always having to wade through the creeks and stuff. It's popular for horse packers, and so this was an example of a bridge for stock to go across the river. And also, by the way, these rivers during the springtime just get really big, so that's one of the reasons why they have these bridges. Here's another bridge with just one hiker at a time, more primitive bridge where they just cut a tree down and dragged it across a creek. And here's a photograph of a seasonal bridge. This is actually up in Glacier. And speaking of Glacier, I get up to the Two Medicine River, and this is the southern end of Glacier National Park. And I'm not certain if I ever saw a glacier in Glacier National Park. It is beautiful, lots of wildlife there. And this is not talking about the hikers here, but this was the last hostel that I stayed at in East Glacier. And about half these people had just finished hiking up to Canada and had come back and were getting ready to catch a train or hitchhike out of town. And the other half had just come into town. I was leaving the next morning to finish up my hike. And so again, we have Half Mile Gin and Porky and Kingpin here, as well as some other people, Denver and Pneumonia. And here, this is Ninja. She was a German woman that actually had met on the Pacific Crest Trail in 2019, and she remembered me. And we leapfrogged all along the way. I mean, from Colorado, central Colorado here to the end. But the only reason why we would leapfrog is because she would hike off like 20, 30 miles. She went off the CDT and hiked through the Tetons and came back onto the CDT. And then she hiked a number of trails in Glacier National Park, not just the CDT. So she was a very fast hiker. So continuing on through Glacier, this is Atlantic Falls. So you're on the side that drains to the Atlantic. There's also Pacific Falls, and this is Triple Divide Peak. So one side drains to the Pacific, and the other side where I'm at drains to the Atlantic. And here over on the right, drains up to the Arctic Ocean. And there's some nice waterfalls in Glacier. This was about the extent of the snow that I saw. This was morning one day as I was getting ready to do the last leg out of a organized campground. And this was my last campsite along Lake Elizabeth in Glacier. And next morning, got up and had to cross one more bridge before getting to the end of the trail here. The trail comes up to this parking lot, and they have this rock wall and sign. And if you turn 180 degrees, you look north, and this is the custom house on the left for the US, and then the custom house on the right down below here for Canada. And the road was closed for some reason, somewhat associated with COVID, but I think they also were trying to save money. They didn't open up this port of entry, which is usually open, I think, from May through September or October. They do close it for the winter. And so I hiked down this remaining bit. There was a border patrol agent that was keeping an eye on me as I hiked down here, and got down to the monument for Canada and the United States. You can see the Canadian custom house over here. And that was the end of my trip. Actually had to find a way back and spent some money paying somebody to drive me to Kalispell. And then there they still had flights until Labor Day, direct from Kalispell to San Francisco International Airport, and flew back home and made it back to Novato for the end of my trail. So that really concludes my presentation.
Thank you for viewing this Next Village video recording. We hope you enjoyed it. Please help us spread the word and tell friends and neighbors about Next Village events and services for seniors and adults with disabilities in San Francisco. Visit our website to learn more about our vibrant, growing network, as well as to view our calendar of upcoming Zoom and in-person events and activities in San Francisco. Our website is nextvillagesf.org. Contact us to join our email list to learn about events and resources for seniors in San Francisco. And subscribe to the Next Village YouTube channel by clicking the button below.